Hey guys, this video is going to be pretty brief description of the structure of DNA. So I definitely wanted to start off with describing what this weird picture is. And DNA is a nucleic acid, which is what the Na in DNA stands for. And it is made up of the monomer, which is what this is, called a nucleotide. A nucleotide is made up of three main parts. The first part being a phosphate. The second being what the D in DNA stands for, which is deoxyribose, which is a 5-carbon sugar or a pentose sugar. You can see it as 5 sides. And a nitrogen-containing base, and those are going to be either adenosine, tyrosine, guanine, or cytosine, but you just have to remember that the base here is always nitrogen and is either going to be A, T, C, or G. It's important to mention that nucleotides are only going to be one or have one of those 4 bases. So a nucleotide is not going to have all 4. It's going to have one of the 4. And what happens is that these nitrogen bases pair up in the center of our DNA molecule, which is actually depicted here. And that is the double helix, which was discovered by Rosalind Franklin really first, and then published by Watson and Crick, who won the Nobel Prize back in the 1960s. And I do want to mention a couple things about the double helix, but I'm not going to stress too much about the little nitty-gritty details. So as you can see here, we have our nitrogenous bases, which make up the steps or the rungs of our DNA double helix. It's called a double helix because it's not just one strand, but it's actually 2 strands of DNA molecules that are bonded together with hydrogen bonds. The blue part of this diagram is going to be the sugar and phosphate backbone, which is what I depicted in the nucleotide in the last part of the video. So the sugar and phosphate make up the sort of sides of this double helix or this twisted ladder. And then obviously the bases make up the middle. And the bases are really what is holding the center of the DNA together. And it's important to note that A and T have 2 hydrogen bonds and C and G have 3 hydrogen bonds. So it actually takes more energy to break bonds between C and G than it does between A and T, just because one more bond to break is going to cost a little bit more energy to get through and to separate the DNA when it's time to replicate. So it is important to note that percentage of A that is in DNA will always be the same as the percentage of T that makes up a DNA molecule because they pair together. So for instance, if a DNA molecule is 13% A, it's going to be 13% T because they pair. And also, same thing with C and G, they're going to be the same. But what if we have 13% A? How do you know what percent of C there is? And the quick and easiest way to solve this is, okay, if you know A and C do not pair together, you just do 50 minus 13, and that will give you the value of C, which in this case will be 37%. And if you want to check your answer, your nucleotides or your different nitrogenous bases should always equal 100%. So if A is 13, T would also be 13%, C is 37%, and that means G would also be 37%. If you add all those together, it equals 100%, so all the math checks out. Last but not least, I do want to note that DNA is what's called anti-parallel, meaning we have 2 strands that make up DNA, and they run in what's called opposite directions. So for instance, if this DNA strand here, which is going to kind of twist around, if it is in the 3 to 5 direction, which is just based on what carbon of the sugar is free and what carbon on the sugar has a phosphate, don't worry too much about that. What I really want you to know is that if it's 3 to 5 here, and you can trace it back, this is the same strand, that means on the other side, it has to be 5 to 3. And this will come into play, this anti-parallel situation is going to come into play when DNA replicates because it's going to cause one strand of DNA to be very easily replicated, and the other strand has to go through a little bit more of a challenging process to replicate as it is going in the opposite direction. So just make a note, anti-parallel is what that's called. And that in a nutshell is the basic structure of DNA that you need to know.